Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to wait a minute or two for people to trickle in. We have a lot of people joining right now, so should be starting in about 2 minutes.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us.
Hi, everyone in the chat. Good to see you. Oh, we got a lot of folks joining, so just going to give it one more minute and then we will kick off the webinar. Sounds good. Okay, guys. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Katarina. I'm thrilled to be the moderator for this session, but hopefully it'll be as little as possible of me speaking because we all came here for our incredible speakers. Today, we're diving into a topic that's becoming increasingly critical as cloud environments grow more complex. We often hear about cost allocation, but as orgs mature, the focus is shifting towards total cost of ownership. So to help us navigate this transition, we have two fantastic experts who have been hands-on in the field. We have Nicole Boyd, who is a certified FinOps professional and currently a FinOps consultant at Capgemini, where she works with a range of public and private sector organizations to drive FinOps maturity across cloud cost management, governance, and operating model capabilities. She also played a key role in building out Capgemini's FinOps tooling capability in the UK, including the associated vendor ecosystem. Nicole previously worked in FinOps in the FinOps tooling space at Cloud Health as a technical account manager and is actively involved with the wider FinOps community. So it's a pleasure to have her today. And then we have FinOps' own very own Elly. She joins us with an extensive background in cloud cost management, spanning past roles in strategic sourcing, finance, and biz ops. Prior to joining Finout, she led the cloud FinOps team for Disney Entertainment and ESPN, where she was instrumental in architecting enterprise forecasting processes and spearheading large-scale cost optimization programs. So now on the customer success team at Finout, she leverages her hands-on experiences to help organizations build and mature their FinOps practices using Finout. So I should have had this up before we begin, a bit of housekeeping. We have a Q&A session at the end. So any questions you have, you should be able to submit them through the questions area. And then we also love an active chat. So keep sending in your thoughts as we get through the presentation or the speaking session. And then finally, this is being recorded. So if you miss anything or if you think someone on your team would find it valuable, or make sure to get it out to you, and it should be available on Finout's YouTube as well. So let's get into it. Our first question is, when does tracking cloud spend stop being enough and calculating true TCO become a necessity? I'll hand it over to Elly to get us started.
Yeah, thanks, Kat. I'm happy to be here. If you go to that next slide for me. In my personal experience and what I hear from a lot of my customers is, you hit this threshold where just the sheer dollar value triggers a shift in the conversation. That threshold is different at any organization. But what I've seen is often, that cloud cost line item in the budget slowly rises to the top. And once it's number one, it gathers a lot of attention, especially from leadership. And your leadership stops asking the easy questions like, how much did we spend? And the questions get harder. What did we get for that spend? Are we getting the full value out of our partnerships? So many times the why behind TCO is really optimization driven or a focus on profitability. And it becomes increasingly important when you try to optimize, because you can't optimize what you don't understand. What I mean is, without clear ownership, you have no baseline. And without a baseline, you can't really prove your optimization efforts are actually making a difference net. So understanding who owns what is always a necessary first step ahead of any cost savings effort. Understanding total cost of ownership is also important with regards to making smart business decisions. So a business is determining how much a product should be priced, or the return on an investment of moving forward with a project. We need to understand the full context, the full picture to be making these accurate decisions. Also, infrastructure is fragmented across multiple platforms. I think lots of us in FinOps, this is a very common trend that we see. I remember when I worked on the finance team back in the day, one of the first tasks that I was asked to do was figure out why we had two data platforms. Why was one so much more expensive than the other? I took a closer look and found that the cheaper vendor wasn't really cheaper. It was that the compute hosting spend was running on AWS. And because of that important part of the total cost of ownership for running that data platform was being captured entirely elsewhere. So when we were trying to compare and think critically about these two vendors, it wasn't even an apples to apples comparison. We needed to understand that full cost of ownership in order to fairly and accurately compare those costs and be able to say which one is definitively more expensive or not. And ultimately, I think cloud spend only gets you so far. It explains what you paid, but total cost of ownership seeks to explain what you own in the context of your business, whether it's products, teams, or outcomes. And those are a lot of the reasons I've seen a lot of organizations shift in that direction.
Great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Building off that, so when you're approaching TCO, would love to understand what can be hiding in your cloud bill that's preventing you from seeing the true TCO. So Nicole and Elly, where are the sneaky costs hiding?
Yeah, I'll kick this one off, and then I think Nicole has some things to add. But among the teams that I work with, many have the goal of 100% cost allocation. The objective, ensure that someone out there is responsible for every single dollar of the cloud bill. And it's my job to help my customers get to that point. But what I found is that last, I'd say maybe 10 to 20% of cost, and allocating that is where it starts to get messy. What do you do with untagged resources? Who's on the hook for enterprise support fees? I think egress and data transfer costs are a bit of a head scratcher in this area. Are they being funneled back to the teams that are actually driving the traffic, or are they just sitting in a centralized bucket getting probably ignored because no one's responsible to them? Observability, security tooling is the same in the same situation. So if things like this aren't being taken into account when evaluating TCO, I'd say your TCO might not really be a total cost of ownership, but more of a partial picture.
Yeah, so in the work that I've been doing with hello to everybody, first of all, I haven't said hello yet, it's nice to be here today. So the work that I've been doing with a couple of the public sector organizations I've been working with over the last couple of years, where we're looking at TCO, we've been looking at infrastructure. Obviously, we've been looking at infrastructure, but we've moved on. While that's being done, we've also been looking a little bit wider, and I think the sort of first realization about TCO at scale is basically that the cloud bill is only a fraction of what they actually own and what they need to be able to allocate to calculate the true TCO. And in my experience, the biggest blind spot is almost always people costs. So your engineering effort, your operational support, on-call manual processes, rework that is caused by poor design decisions. And so over time, these costs are sort of routinely outweighing the infrastructure costs. And they're harder to see and they're harder to attribute. And then you have, as you mentioned, things like your shared services, and they don't sit neatly anywhere. So you have your, things like your security platforms, identity, networking, logging. And, these are things that everyone's depending on, but no one has or feels a direct ownership of the cost. And so they're excluded, or they're under-allocated, or they're sort of, I don't know, stuck somewhere based on something. It's not necessarily accurate or clear. And licensing actually is another one on this. So, you get those enterprise agreements, which are already paid for, and they're tools that are quietly scaling with usage. And because they don't show up as variable spend, they're treated as a sunken cost. So, those are the sorts of things that we are looking at, because ultimately those all materially change the economics. And then there's another consideration in the governance overhead. So things like your cost reconciliation, forecasting cycles, audit prep, chargeback disputes, they're all real, they're all reoccurring people costs, and they, at least as far as I can see, almost never get attributed to the services that are creating the complexity. So what I'm seeing is consistently that TCO inflation isn't driven by cloud inefficiency, it's driven by operating model friction. And if you don't model that, you're not really modeling your ownership at the end of the day.
And I'd love to get your insights on the next question as well, Nicole. I know you have a lot of thoughts on this. How do you find the one unit metric that proves the business value of your cloud spend?
Unsurprisingly, there is no universal answer to what is the right unit metric. The right unit depends entirely on how value is created and consumed, not necessarily how the cloud estate happens to be organized. So, most organizations, they start with technical units, your cost per subscription, your cost per service, your cost per cluster, because that's where your data is, right? And that's a sensible starting point, but it also tends to drive local optimization rather than better decisions. And so as FinOps matures, the unit usually shifts closer to the business. So your cost per transaction, cost per case, cost per customer, cost per insight. And so that's the shift that matters, because the unit you choose directly shapes the behavior. Technical units optimize spend, business aligned units force prioritization, and they force trade-offs. And what's noticeably changed over the last couple of years is that the conversation, they're much easier to have. FinOps is a mindset now is far more recognized and accepted than it was a couple of years ago. So we're not having to spend the first phase of trying to figure this out, explaining what FinOps is and fighting for the right to have FinOps. It's not just for cost cutting, and it's something that's critical to the way that your business is working. And so because the cultural groundwork is already largely in place, or at least it's more widely understood, teams are far more open to talking about demand, about the value, about the outcomes much earlier on. Obviously, there is still resistance, but where that exists, it's more in practical elements. So data quality, ownership, decisions, and those are often, certainly in what I've seen, those are often the real constraints, is trying to figure out what we have and how we can use it, and how do we fix what we don't have.
Great. Yeah. Makes a ton of sense. So when tags fail or resources are shared, how do you solve the noisy neighbor problem and allocate costs accurately? I'll pass this over to Elly. I know you have a lot of experience in this.
Sure. If you go to the next slide, I put this table together because I think the first step here is to distinguish between shared costs and unallocated costs. The reason being they require different approaches and different fixes. So shared costs are like the utility bill for your cloud. So I guess maybe the noisy neighbors are like your roommates in this situation, or I've heard other practitioners call it like a tax, the tax of doing business in the cloud. These are resources and services like enterprise support, or maybe like security firewalls that multiple teams use and benefit from. For shared resources, you seek to solve the noisy neighbor problem through reallocation, which I'll talk about briefly in the next slide in a moment. And then unallocated costs are your untagged or your orphaned resources, your tagless, label-less resources, things that maybe have been running for a while and now no one really knows what's going on over there. And for unallocated items, the strategy I'd say is more straightforward than shared. Tag it so it can be allocated or reduce it. I see when we're doing efforts to clean up unallocated costs, it's often a good opportunity to clean up things that maybe shouldn't be running anymore and maybe garner some cost savings from that as well. If you could click to that next slide, Kat. So shared spend is addressed with reallocation, and I want to challenge you all to avoid letting those costs just sit in a centralized shared bucket where no one owns them and they're just getting forgotten. And trust me, I used to manage my FinOps spend in that way, and these things tend to grow. And now we see cloud providers hit us with things like extended support fees, where it's like, you got to get out of these things, upgrade, delete them. There's a financial mechanism now that we're seeing to get organizations to move off of outdated things. Reallocation, when I use that term, means taking those shared amounts and then breaking out the cost to whether it's teams or services based on some sort of ratio. Often what I see most commonly is reallocation based on spend. So using the relationship of how much a team is spending compared to other teams and using that to reallocate some of the shared spend back to them. I think there are also avenues where reallocation based on like a technical telemetry ratio also makes sense. Maybe it's like the number of queries or total CPU hours. Nicole, I know when we were prepping for this, you had mentioned that you'd worked with a customer that they didn't want to split up their enterprise support by percentage. I think you said they wanted to break it down by maybe support tickets, but that's just another example of different ways to break out spend. Regardless of which method you choose, though, I urge you all to consult your engineers. This reallocation exercise is ultimately going to increase their total spend. And so the methodology must be defendable. They are going to ask questions. And so when engineers are involved in evaluating what is the fair way to split the bill, knowing that you work together, the numbers are going to gain a bit more credibility because of that. Okay. And unallocated spend. Nicole, did you have anything you wanted to add on shared?
No, mine's more on the people side. Sorry. So you carry on. I'll carry on when you're done.
Yeah, no problem. Okay. So unallocated spend. I remember when I had an analyst and I was teaching her about FinOps. I was teaching her about all the data that she'd be working with. And I remember explaining to her, like, you're a detective. And if I can continue this analogy, the cur is your crime scene. So even when tags are missing, there's an absence of data or metadata. There are always clues that you can look out for. Whether it's an account ID, almost every dollar at least has an account ID or a region, or maybe there's like a naming convention that you recognize in the way that something was labeled. Anything can be a lead to help point you to who the owner could be. So put that detective hat on. Another point here is that, a detective is only as good as their tools. So I remember being an analyst and I'd have these massive Excel mapping tables and I was using these VLOOKUPs and they would break all the time. And if you are fighting this battle like I was, you've already lost. So over here at Finout, one of my favorite features is something we call virtual tags. And that helps automate that logic dynamically, or it syncs with your mapping data. It's especially powerful when you're trying to stitch together all those manual mappings that you're trying to do across different vendors. If you've got a multi-cloud infrastructure, it makes it a lot easy to translate all those mappings into a way that scales, so you can focus on actually triaging problems, finding root cause, instead of figuring out why your formulas aren't working. And then finally, I think a lot of us know this, but the ultimate goal is governance here. Set up guardrails, automated enforcement. So you're enforcing at the source and creating an environment where resources just cannot be deployed. They're not allowed to be deployed unless you're meeting the minimum tagging requirements.
I wanted to add something just I'll get to people in a minute, but you reminded me of something from my days at Cloud Health, working with companies there on the virtual tagging thing. Cloud Health had that capability as well. And I remember often the sort of pushback I get from the clients I was working with is, but if we put virtual tags on our infrastructure and it's grouped inside this tool, nobody's ever going to go back and retag it or fix the errors and what have you, because it's all sorted out here. And this was a reason to resist using virtual tags. And my answer consistently is, but if you have the option to be able to group it within this tool, to be able to use that for cost allocation or for a visibility of what you're spending on an application or a service or a cost center, whatever the case is, that doesn't mean you can't go back and fix your tags in your cloud service provider portal. Why wouldn't you use it? Because the longer you leave it sort of out there floating, the longer you're unable to allocate these costs because you don't know where they live, or you don't know how to find out where they live. So I think that's a really sort of key kind of consideration there, and it's a useful tool to be able to use. I wanted to sort of bring this over to the people side and just talk a bit about what I've been doing with again, one of the public sector clients I've been working with. I spent quite a lot of last year trying to work on a cost allocation and TCO model for this particular client. And, they had their public cloud infrastructure. They were pretty much sorted on that. They didn't need help with that. What they wanted to be able to figure out was how much it would cost for them to be able to deliver features that the engineering teams were working on. So they had, a pipeline of all of these requests that their the users on the platform had logged, and they wanted to know firstly, like, if we could estimate how much it's going to cost, but also can we tell them how much the delivery of this particular feature is going to cost from end to end. So we started digging. We dug into Jira, we dug into Atlassian, we dug into Excels, we dug into finance spreadsheets, we dug into everything. And while we found a lot of data, we also found that there was a lot of data that wasn't there. So there were tickets that were logged for different parts of the process. So they would have had like the initial ticket that was logged where they did the overview of the effort that they thought that it was going to take to deliver the feature. And then that would be passed over to the actual delivery team. And they would then go, okay, cool, I can see how you've estimated this, but actually this is how long it's going to take. And this is how many engineers we're going to have to assign. And this is the actual effort required. And if we were lucky, there was some indication between those two parts of the pipeline that linked one to the other. In most cases, there was no data. We didn't know which ticket related to which other ticket. And so we had lots of random data with no actual indication of where it belonged or what it was attributed to, or how many engineers were working or were estimated, or who had worked how many hours. There was just so much data that was missing. And so at the end of it, what came out of that was a very extensive data gap analysis, which is obviously very useful, but requires quite a lot of retrospective work. And the aim of that was really to say, well, this is where you are and this is where you want to get to. And to get to where you want to be, where you can estimate what something is going to cost based on work that has been done in the past, because you've been able to allocate all of the costs that need to be allocated to it. You need to start collecting all of this types of, you need to make sure everything is there. In addition to that, they had the on-call support, which Elly mentioned earlier. They wanted to know how they could allocate that to tenants. And initially we'd said, well, you could do that by proportion of their associated AWS spend. And their answer to that was, okay, but just because they have more cost because it's a bigger tenant, does not mean that they need more support. It could be a smaller tenant that needs more support because they're a newer tenant. And so we then went through the process of actually building out data models where we were pulling in things like service desk requests or hours spent, or the number of tickets that were assigned, and engineers that were assigned to all that kind of stuff. How many P1 versus P2 versus P3 incidents that were happening. And we used the data that we got out of that to produce a complexity score. And we used the complexity score in addition to their percentage of their cloud spend to then reallocate some of, was to reallocate the support costs to them. It wasn't an exact science because some of it had to be nuanced, because if I assign you a score of 10, how do you know then how much cost to apportion to that? But it was a work in progress, and they ended up sort of stepping down from that because of the amount of data that needed to be done in order to get their TCO, their cost allocation, where it needs to be. But that's the sort of the route that we needed to go on to make sure that we knew what they needed in order to be able to calculate what their TCO is.
That's a great example. Moving on to the next question: How do you get developers to prioritize cost optimization over shipping new features? This is tough one.
Oof. I think this is like the $1 billion FinOps question. It's like the holy grail. If anyone feels like they have completely solved this, I would love to hear from you. But I think a good first step to properly prioritizing is you need to understand the full picture. We've been talking a lot around like total cost of ownership, understanding that full picture. And I think in terms of prioritizing, giving that context to as many people as possible is super important. My suggestion is to bring monthly visibility to how engineering decisions are impacting the cloud bill and budget. And to talk through this, I wanted to, this is a mock-up of a slide that I call like a cloud variance report. It's not my prettiest work, my apologies. I've created a few iterations of this during my career, but each one always had sort of the minimum sections that I'm outlining here. And my goal was to make sure that I wasn't generating yet another report of charts and numbers. This is intended to be a narrative around our engineering decisions. If you see here in the top right with the variance summary, budget risk is low. January closed 100,000 favorable to budget. That sounds like good news. Most organizations would look at that and be like, awesome, we didn't exceed budget, pat ourselves on the back and move on. But as FinOps practitioners, we need to understand why. Why were we off? Does this impact the future month's budget? Was there a project that was supposed to happen that didn't? Why are we seeing favorability? So if you see in the bottom right table of largest variances by team, you'll notice that the data platforms team came in pretty favorable, but they didn't just simply save money. They implemented data retention policies that resulted in $150,000 a month reduction. And then in contrast, in the next line, we see Project Billy, a little dummy name project, driving an unplanned $50,000 overage. When you're managing an infrastructure that has maybe 1,000 services in any given month, you're probably going to have some overages and underages, and they're going to net out hopefully close to your budget. And I find it really important to tell that story, both the good and the bad. It brings you to that final number. And the context is really important. And so ultimately, when you present the data in this way, broken down by team and by project, it changes the culture and creates a habit of explaining and justifying value. I think I saw in the chat a question around like getting executives involved in the conversation. I think this is a great way to do it because you're putting the costs in the context of the business decisions that they're making. And so you're not just pointing the finger and telling someone you're spending too much, you're showing them really like two things here. So the first one is visibility. We're bringing attention to the efficiency work that's happening, the engineering new features that are coming out, and then also to context, right? We've got a project going on, Project Billy, it's costing us X. We should keep an eye on it because we're seeing it trending higher than expected. By mapping those dollars to your business context, whether it's like a security upgrade or in the case of data platforms, a retention policy, you're actually giving developers the context and background they need to treat cost as a technical requirement, and that there are eyes on what they're doing and how cost is a really important sort of part of the equation to them. I think people who have heard me talk before know that I hate the idea of FinOps being the cost police. And in my experience, reporting on cost this way and bringing, again, attention to both sides of the equation, overages and underages, optimization, and sort of new features and other things that are increasing costs, you're moving away from being cloud police to more of a partner. And I think that's what FinOps is really all about.
I totally agree on that. I will add a personal anecdote there. So my husband is a developer, and I remember in the early days of our conversation, this was circa 2019. So, when this was all sort of blowing up in terms of FinOps having an actual title and all that kind of stuff. And I remember saying to him, does he care about the cost of the infrastructure that he uses to, do the developing stuff that he does for his company? And he said to me, he's like, no, not really. I don't need to care. And that sort of evolved over, I think it was probably about a year later. And he said, they've actually started implementing FinOps at the company that he works for. And so the conversations that I have with him now are completely different because they have KPIs that are tied to not necessarily to optimization, but certainly to the costs of the infrastructure that they're using. And I think that's really key. The client that I'm busy working with at the moment, sort of to tie into that executive buy-in comment, FinOps optimization, or at least lean computing, that's mandated by the board of this organization. They have a specific work stream for optimization of infrastructure, and they've been incredibly successful in optimizing their infrastructure, but also in changing the process and the governance around how infrastructure is used and how it's designed to make it less wasteful. And so I think, you know, sort of tying back a little bit earlier where I was talking about culture, I think that the culture of FinOps is so much more embedded now, and it's so much more front of mind. And I think if you're understanding how you need to talk to these things to the engineering teams, there is a way to make them interested and to get them to buy into how this is done and why they should be doing it.
Yeah. I'll move on to the next question, but those are great answers. Approaching a huge issue, but this is the oh, didn't realize that was a slide. This is the other major, issue or movement in this space. How do you adapt TCO models for the unpredictable costs of AI and LLMs?
We'd not have gotten through a webinar if we weren't talking about AI, at least at some point. Everybody's talking about it. So AI and LLM, those costs, they don't behave like infrastructure or licenses that we've been modeling, that we're used to modeling. Because they're usage driven, volatile, they're very behavioral, and that means that the static single number TCO models stop working pretty quickly for these. So full disclaimer, this is something that I'm only just starting to see in the organizations I'm working with. It hasn't fully landed yet in most TCO or cost allocation models, but the direction of travel is becoming clear. It's also something that the wider FinOps community is actively working through. And if you look at the work coming out of the FinOps Foundation, there's a clear shift towards thinking about AI spend in terms of usage and unit economics, rather than treating it as just another line on your infrastructure bill. And that in thinking is absolutely going to influence how we calculate TCO for AI going forward. And so what that means in practice is moving away from asset style costing and towards usage economics. So things like your cost per interaction, cost per automated task, cost per decision supported. Those are all the kind of metrics that make the cost visible in the same way that value is actually created, which is critical if you want to scale AI responsibly. And just as importantly, the AI spend needs to be treated as a demand management problem, not a technology problem. So things like your prompt behavior, retries, your model choice, access controls, all of those things tend to drive costs far more than raw computing pricing. And those are all design and governance decisions. They're not necessarily engineering ones. Well, they're not engineering ones. So TCO models also need to assume that change as well. The models evolve very quickly, architecture shifts, and cost switching is real. So, treating AI as a long-lived, stable asset is going to create false confidence. And it's also almost certainly going to guarantee budget shock later on. And as I mentioned, the broader FinOps culture shift that I've been talking about, that's it really makes these conversations far more possible now. So a few years ago, as I mentioned, we were talking openly about things like this: volatility, behavioral cost drivers, value-based controls. That would have been very abstract, very uncomfortable. But today there is a much sort of wider openness to this way of thinking. So while it's not something that I fully implemented, it's definitely something I'm still tackling and trying to figure out. It's very clearly where TCO is heading. And it's where FinOps Foundation is helping to shape the way of thinking. They have working groups that are working on this very topic. And so, yeah, I think that would be it. I guess my closing remark on that is that with AI, TCO stops being about cost certainty and it becomes about economic control. And so the question there shouldn't be how much does this cost? It should be what is the outcome that we're buying with this, and is it worth the variability?
Awesome. And yeah, I'm really excited because we have perfect amount of time, about 11 minutes to get through. It's awesome to see that we have questions coming in. So I'll start with a question that was in the question chat, and then I'll move over to the actual chat where people have been asking questions as well. But first question is, are you calculating any sort of correlation coefficient with your business unit cost to calculate how much of the unit change drives the cloud cost variance?
I can take that one. I will say, so long ago, when I was first understanding what FinOps was, one of my first roles was forecasting cloud spend back when I was working at Hulu, so for a streaming company. And we had this really cool model, and every one of our top services, we had an equation, and we would input different business metrics. So it would be like hours watched, active subs, total subscribers. And we would run regression models on cost and those related metrics and come up with a coefficient. And the coefficient would create sort of like, if you remember, like y equals mx plus b from algebra class. We were using different drivers as inputs into our equation to calculate costs. And I remember first starting, and those coefficients, those correlations were really strong. There was a clear connection between the drivers and the cost. Drivers go up, cost goes up, and that relationship was rather consistent. But over time, that started to unravel, and month after month, those correlations got weaker. And what I found was there were really two things going on. The first one was there was a huge business directive to combine systems. So we were, the integration of Disney Plus and Hulu. We were trying to figure out, what are the best ways to combine those systems there. As you know now, you can access Hulu on Disney Plus. But at the time, those correlations were unraveling because those relationships were broken. We were working on our platform. We were optimizing for cost in parallel. And so the historical relationship that we were training those regression models it wasn't helpful anymore. The way that things were working had fundamentally shifted. So we actually ended up moving away from that during the time of sort of transition. But I'm starting to see more organizations want to dabble in demand-driven forecasting, where you use a business metric and you multiply it by some sort of coefficient to estimate costs. Is that always the most accurate way to forecast? Frankly, no. I haven't seen it be a great predictor, but in my mind, it's a great benchmark of where you should be, right? We should be, growing in a way that aligns to some sort of revenue-related metric, right? That's how you become profitable. It's how you stay in business. So I like to think of doing a sort of correlation with business metrics and that sort of like unit cost calculation as maybe a first pass. Or potentially a goal for where spend should be trending.
Great. Nicole, I don't know if you have any thoughts, or I can go to another question so we can get through as many as possible. We probably have time
No,
for
go ahead, Elly.
a couple more. Okay, so Tiny Tolkien said, I am a huge proponent for a cloud and cost management tooling. How do you see business cases success versus native cloud cost management tooling arguments that AWS has, like Kudos dashboarding on QuickSight, as an example?
We're busy going through a similar conversation where I am at the moment, trying to justify the cost of something like that versus what already exists in the public clouds, in the native tools. I think the argument that we're using here, and the argument that I think I consistently have used for all the years, having come from a tooling background, is the need for having one place where everything lives. And I think the nice thing about a lot of the tooling now is there are the options to be able to bring in data that doesn't necessarily just come from the public cloud tools. Having one place for all of your cost visibility to live, and to have a place for all of your data, your optimization data, your usage data, all that kind of stuff for different clouds, but also potentially for different platforms, for others, cost source, all that kind of thing. It's really, really useful. And I think that's not something you're going to get from an AWS console or from an Azure console. And so having that third party, that single pane of glass, is the tool that is the term that we always use, is really powerful and really useful.
Yeah, I'd say the moment you're in a multi-cloud environment, or perhaps your FinOps team, you did a great job investigating and managing AWS spend. Well, what about Azure? What about Databricks? What about Datadog? Really the moment that your visibility is required across a broader list of vendors is when I would start moving away from a native tool and start to look at third parties. I like to tell people, like, AWS is never going to build a dashboard for you to see GCP and Azure alongside your AWS spend.
No, and I think also importantly on that, even if you are just single cloud, there are other services you might be using that have their own portals that you need to be able to access the usage and cost data from. And so having someone to pull that into, so even if you are just an Azure house or an AWS house, it's so much more useful if you have those additional platform services or whatever to be able to pull in.
Yeah, awesome. I think we have time for one more question. I think this is a good one. We've touched on a little bit, but Marcel asks, hoping to hear some best practices on engaging senior management on FinOps. They should care about TCO and even a level above that.
I would be happy to, because I bang on about this all the time. I think if you're having conversations about FinOps, the conversations you need to be having is about the value that FinOps brings. Every action, every recommendation, you should be able to relate to that, to the value that you're going to get from doing it. In my experience, when you are talking about the value, the business outcomes, how that's going to drive revenue or reduce, overheads or whatever it is, if you bring it back to value, they will always understand that. You just need to make sure that the value that you're mentioning is relevant to the executive you're talking to.
Great. Yeah. Let me see if there's any other. I know there's a bunch of other questions, but we are coming up on time. This is a little more specific one that I see people discussing. Is there a pre-deployment mechanism that can provide engineers with a realistic rough cost estimate of the changes that are about to be deployed? A little bit different topic.
Elly, do you have anything on that?
I'd say cloud cost calculators are a good place to start. Though what I've seen is once you have, custom enterprise discounts, or, you're working toward a total cost of ownership where you need to factor into things that maybe those calculators aren't taking into account, that often creates a need for internally built calculators. So I have a lot of experience creating like rate cards that sort of are more customized to the organization that I'm working for, that captures that total cost of ownership amount in the unit cost. And then it just becomes a matter of a price times quantity calculation. Again, not perfect, but when you're talking about building something that you haven't even started, putting hands on keyboards for, I think it's a great place to start to try to size things. I also always recommend working in ranges. Sometimes it's good to add maybe a 20% or a 10% plus or minus buffer because of uncertainty. Those are my 2 cents there.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I do not have a predefined method or script or anything like that. I tend to tackle that from the ground up. I think that there are probably a couple of common denominators that you could use, and I think I don't even know if a playbook or a run book exists for that sort of thing, and maybe that's something I'll take on myself to go and discover just based on work that I've done in the past. I think that there are things that can help you figure out where to start looking, but I think it's really difficult to create something that is standard that you would use, because it depends entirely on what is available to you to be able to build out what that model is going to look like. Yeah, if I figure that out, stay tuned. I'll mention that on LinkedIn if I manage to get to creating that.
Yeah. And speaking of LinkedIn, we're coming up on time, but I want to encourage everyone to connect and follow Elly, Nicole, and I, and also Finout, if you want to see more of these webinar sessions, we're going to continue doing them. On LinkedIn, we want to continue the conversation. Thank you to Elly and Nicole, but also to everyone who joined and asked questions and in the chat. Made it a blast and very enlightening conversation. We are going to try and get back to all the questions that have come into the chat and continue the conversation as well. So even though we run out of time, we will get to your questions, and looking forward to seeing you on the next webinar. But I hope everyone has a great rest of their Tuesday.
I will just add for those that are in the UK, if anybody's at FinOps X Day on 24th of March, I think it's 24th of March, let me know. I'll be there. It'd be good to meet up. Thank you very much. It's been really lovely.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Keep well.